Hey everybody, this is Russ from Metro Game Core. This is the Anbernic RG34XX. I did a lot of videos about it already, but yeah, this thing looks like an original Game Boy Advance. Now, as soon as this thing was announced, I went and I bought myself an original Game Boy Advance because I never owned one of these back in the day. So I bought it for about $80 used, and it took forever to arrive. In fact, it arrived after the RG34XX review unit. But now that I have both of them in hand, I thought it'd be fun to do a quick little video just comparing the two, the hardware and the software, and how is the experience between the two. Honestly, they cost about the same amount of money, $80 for a used one and about $70 for the new one, and I want to see which one is going to be the best value for you and which one is going to hit those nostalgia points in the right way. Now, even though these do look very similar, there's a big difference between them. Obviously, one of them is original hardware. You'll have to use things like cartridges to actually play the games, whereas this one is an emulation device, so not only will it play Game Boy Advance, but a bunch of others, but we're really going to focus on GBA in this video. Either way, I think it's going to be fun to compare both the old school versus the new, and so without any further delay, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, first thing we need to really look at here is the fact that these are so similar to one another. I think that Anbernic actually did a really good job in replicating the original Game Boy Advance feel. Like I mentioned in my 34XX video, these are so closely aligned that it feels like Anbernic actually took one of those reproduction shells and then retrofitted it, made it a new design to work with the 34XX because they are just so similar. Obviously, there are some differences. For example, the shell and the screen itself, they're completely different forms. And then, of course, we've got extra buttons on the 34XX. Same thing up top, we've got different I/O, a lack of a cartridge slot and GBA link cable, and then also we've got some trigger buttons as well. But really, when it comes down to it, the design is just so similar. I mean, look at the difference between the two. They are just so close. Even the battery compartment is the same shape and size. Now, in terms of coloring, it is a little bit different. The original Game Boy Advance has more of a bluish hue to it compared to the 34XX, but it is still very close. And I think that if you didn't see the original Game Boy Advance, you would think that, yeah, this is absolutely the exact same thing. Now, the GBA that I bought used is not the best quality. This is an original model, which means that it's still a lot dinged up, and the rubber membranes here are going to be quite old, and it doesn't have a replacement screen, so this is not backlit or anything, and you can see there is a gap between the glass and the screen itself like it was back in the day. So this handheld is over 20 years old, and I think it's actually still in pretty good shape, all things considered. Like I mentioned, I bought it on Mercari for about $80, and then there was shipping and everything else, so really I spent about $90 getting it to the door. Now, just looking at overall front aesthetics here, I think that the original GBA is just a lot more nostalgic. It obviously has the Game Boy Advance logo here on the bottom, and it just feels a lot more old school because of that older LCD panel. The 34XX still has the spirit of the original Game Boy Advance, so it still does feel very retro, but obviously it has a more modern screen on it, so it looks a little bit more sleek, and obviously it has additional buttons as well. But I think the Anbernic does exactly what it's supposed to do, which is to invoke a bunch of nostalgia while giving you something that's a little bit more modern and still very budget. Let's start by talking about the I/O differences between the two. On the original Game Boy Advance, you really just have your GBA link cable, and then obviously we've got a cartridge slot up top. Meanwhile, on the Anbernic, we've got all sorts of stuff. We've got our M menu or menu button, we've got a reset button, we've got USB-C for charging and peripherals, as well as a mini HDMI out port, so you can actually use this for video out. We've also got, in terms of storage, 2 SD card slots, one for your OS, one for your games, and then of course we've got these trigger buttons. Now, I went into detail about a lot of this stuff in my review video, so I'm not going to go over it too much now, but I will mention that, it is nice to have these trigger buttons. They're not the most comfortable in the world. You can easily access them, but still, it's more likely that you're going to use these for hotkeys with old school systems, but if you're going to play something like PS1, then these do come in clutch. At the end of the day, having these control options is a good thing because it just gives you additional options, and it's nice because they're just kind of out of the way anyway. As you're actually playing it, you often will not press these at all or even notice that they're there unless you need them. Okay, looking at the bottom here, we do have a very similar layout. So on the left side, we've got our power buttons. On the Anbernic, you just press and hold it. This one has an actual physical switch. On the right side, it's also very similar. We've got a volume wheel that actually scrolls up and down with the GBA, but on the Anbernic, it's actually a flick wheel. So you'll flick this left and right. And of course, they also both have headphone jacks, and that's about it. On the back, we have a very similar layout. Even these screw holes are in similar places, but you can see that the GBA has an actual battery compartment with batteries inside of it, whereas the Anbernic has one with a screw hole. And so if you open that up, it will show you a battery pack inside, but it's going to be lithium ion. So I think in terms of convenience, the Anbernic probably wins in that regard because it has a battery pack and you can charge it via the USB-C port. So that is pretty handy that you don't have to replace it with new batteries. But of course, if the battery dies, you're going to have to spend that time charging it. Whereas with the Game Boy Advance itself, this one just uses regular batteries. So you could use new batteries in case they go out. For me personally, I prefer to have a rechargeable battery as well as a USB-C port compared to just having to replace it with AA's. Now, of course, in terms of games, because this is original hardware, you're going to have to use cartridges. You can use, actual cartridges or something like an EverDrive, and these are pretty expensive. It's about $100, I think. So this will allow you to put an SD card in and then play all these games. So this is often what I will use with my GBAs, but of course, if you have cartridges, you can use those as well. I've got a bunch of cartridges, but the thing is, these are actually really expensive, and so I have to be pretty choosy about which ones I buy. And you can see that often I will buy the Japanese versions of these games because often you don't need to actually read anything, especially with the action titles. And so you can save a bit of money by actually importing your games, which is what I will often do. Every once in a while, I will pick up like the English or American version, but lately, yeah, it's been the Japanese ones that I've preferred. Regardless, this is all going to be an additional cost unless you have a bunch of cartridges laying around from back in the day. Now on the sides, it's almost identical. So you see we have a little lanyard thing right here. And then also we've got this same kind of soft plastic here. It's a little bit more rubbery with the Game Boy Advance compared to the Anbernic, but this is also over 20 years old. So maybe this is just time that has worn this down. Either way, it is very similar in terms of design, but this one feels a little bit harder and slicker compared to the original. And it is the exact same thing on the right side as well. Now, in terms of weight, the Anbernic is 186 grams. That is fully charged with the battery and also with an SD card inside of it. So this is going to be basically worst case scenario, how heavy it's actually going to be. The Game Boy Advance is actually a little bit heavier once you add the batteries as well as a cartridge. When I did my original review, I used some numbers I found on the internet, but they didn't factor in AA batteries as well as the cartridge. And so yes, this one is actually heavier than the Anbernic, which is kind of surprising. Now, I think the big question here is going to be the controls. Like, how does it feel compared to an old school Game Boy Advance? So let's talk about each of these. We'll start with actually the start and select buttons. So these are laid out the same. The start button is up top, then select button, but there is a difference. These are actually like a softer rubber button, like on the original Game Boy, whereas these are hard plastic. And so they do feel different. This is a rubber membrane, so it just has a little bit of snap to it, just very similar to like the face buttons, but this one is just softer and mushier, start and select. Now, the D-pads are very similar between the two. They are both hard plastic and about the same similar size. Now, the D-pad one has more prominent arrows on each of the ends compared to the original Game Boy Advance. These are almost invisible, but they are there as well. It also looks like the circle in the center here is bigger on the Game Boy Advance than the Anbernic, but otherwise, yeah, they look and feel very similar. These are both rubber membrane D-pads, and so it's the same kind of slightly mushy, but somewhat tactile and bouncy feeling. Between the two, it does feel like the Game Boy Advance is mushier and a little bit softer, but Anbernic is known for having hard rubber membranes that do break in over time. So in the course of, several months, this actually might feel very similar. And also bear in mind that this has 20 years of wear and tear on it. Now, in terms of pivot, it's also very similar, where the Game Boy Advance is a little bit softer and feels just a little bit more malleable compared to the Anbernic. This one just seems to be at a higher altitude altogether, and so it does pivot, but it does feel like it rocks a little bit more compared to the original Game Boy Advance. This one is just kind of more shifting and sliding. But again, these are very similar in terms of look and feel, and I would say that the Anbernic just feels a little bit bouncier and more modern, again, very similar to other Anbernic devices. And we also cannot discount the fact that the Game Boy Advance is well broken in over time. Now, when it comes to gameplay testing, I think the most appropriate game is going to be Game Boy Advance Contra. And here we're going to do our D-pad test, where I press down on the D-pad and then rock it left and right. With the original Game Boy Advance, it does move a little bit, but not to the point of actually moving the character, but rather they just stand up. And I realize it is hard to see because we have a non-backlit display. But either way, when it comes to actually getting the diagonals and hitting them when I want to and missing them when I don't, it actually is doing a very good job. This is a pretty precise D-pad considering the fact that it is over 20 years old. Now, the Anbernic, like I showed in my review video, is a little bit overly sensitive. It is super easy to be able to pivot this to the point where it does fail the Contra test. I can basically move my character left and right at will while pressing down on the D-pad. And it's hard to say that this is a definitive assessment right here, just because I think that the Anbernic needs a little bit more time to break in. I've been playing it as much as possible, but still, it just needs more time. And so I think that over time, this will probably get a little bit softer. And as a result, I think the pivot will just be a little bit harder. So when it comes down to it, I do think that the Game Boy Advance D-pad is actually more accurate. But again, this has got 20 years of use on it, so that might be a factor. Regardless, when it comes to playing a precision platformer, something like that Contra game, I would rather play it on original hardware than the Anbernic. This one is just a little bit too sensitive. And again, this is probably something that we will have to revisit 6 months from now, after a bunch of people have tested it more and really broken it in, and to see whether or not it's going to be more accurate over time. Okay, now let's look at the face buttons, and obviously the big difference here is just the fact that this has 2, whereas the Anbernic has 4, but otherwise they are very similar. Even the design is the same. They have those offset letters here, and they feel pretty similar just in terms of the buttons themselves. The big difference is that the original Game Boy Advance has glossy buttons, whereas the Anbernic ones are actually matte, and so this one feels a little bit more slick and kind of catches your skin, whereas this one does not at all. And personally, I prefer the more powdery finish like this. I think it feels really good, and it is a little bit closer to the feel of the D-pad compared to these face buttons up here. Now, in terms of the actual face buttons themselves, the Game Boy Advance again has probably been broken in a bunch, but it's still really tactile and responsive. It is a rubber membrane, but I would not call it mushy. It actually bounces back really nicely. It also produces a satisfying click when you press down on it and then let go. It's basically the rest of the rubber around the button hitting the rest of the shell, and so I like that little clicking sound. It feels good. The Anbernic is very similar. It's rubber membrane, and it pushes down and also clacks up a little bit, but not as much as the original hardware, so this one is actually a little bit quieter. However, when it comes to the resistance of the rubber, it does feel like it takes a little bit more actuation force. And again, this probably has to do with the fact that these are brand new buttons, and so they just obviously need time to break in. Now, when it comes to measuring actuation force, I have a very non-scientific method. So essentially, I just use a kitchen scale, I put the device on it, then I reset it back to 0 grams, and then I just press the button as quickly and as efficiently as I can to see how much force it takes to actually push the button down. And for the original Game Boy Advance, I would say it's somewhere around 80 grams of force. And again, this is non-scientific, but that is a pretty consistent number that I was getting as I was pressing down on the button. Meanwhile, the RG34XX takes a bit more, somewhere between 100 and 110 grams of force. Now that is quite a bit more, and it's actually a pretty high number, but remember this is a rubber membrane button, which means that you have to put a lot of actuation force on it in the beginning, but then when you're holding the button down, it doesn't take a lot of force. It's not like a dome switch, which requires constant pressure. So neither of these buttons are hard to press down on, but the Game Boy Advance one with broken in over 20 years of use is definitely easier to use, and maybe the Anbernic one will get better, but right now it is pretty stiff.
Whoa, so this is next day/editing Russ, and you guys almost let me forget to talk about the shoulder buttons, so let me compare those two really quickly. In general, you can see that the buttons are very similar to one another in terms of just overall shape. There are a couple minor differences, like the text on the Game Boy Advance is a little bit larger than on the shoulder buttons on the Anbernic. However, they do feel quite different. The Game Boy Advance has just a very light travel to it, and it makes a soft click when you press it down. It almost has a mushy feeling to it until you fully actuate the button. At that point, it makes a soft, satisfying click, and I think it's actually a really nice button. Now, the Anbernic does feel different. It's a full-on rubber membrane button, and so when you press it down, it has quite a bit more travel. This one has more of a thunk feeling as opposed to a click, and I don't think it's bad at all, but it also is just not very authentic compared to the original. So really no complaints about either of the buttons, but I do think I prefer the Game Boy Advance just because it's a little bit more shallow and has a nice satisfying click to it. And it's also a little quieter as well. Now both of these shoulder buttons are not loud in any way. In fact, they are both quieter than the face buttons altogether.
Okay, now let's talk about screen between the two, and there are some interesting prospects here. So number one, the original Game Boy Advance is an LCD panel, but it is not backlit. And this one has been notoriously known for being just a bad LCD altogether that just hasn't aged very well. It is hard to see, even under direct lighting like here in the studio. And so this definitely has a more muted look to it compared to something like a backlit display. So playing on this nowadays is a pretty poor experience. To make matters worse, there is a space between the glass panel as well as the LCD itself, and it's a pretty good distance, like 1/4 of an inch. And so what happens is that it's really prone to reflections. So not only is it hard to see, but if you actually try to angle it towards your face, you can see that, yeah, it's super reflective. Like I can see a bunch of my face right here as I'm recording. Hello. This is definitely a more antiquated screen, all things considered. It's just not a great experience compared to the technology that we have today. Now, the Anbernic is a totally different story. It's a backlit LCD, and this one also has an upgraded resolution. So this one is an actual perfect 3x integer scale of the original Game Boy Advance. So playing these games on this screen is really incredible, especially Game Boy Advance. I'm also using an LCD grid overlay right here to just make it look a little bit more like an LCD. And because this is OCA laminated, that means there's no distance between, the screen and the glass itself. It's been laminated together. That means that when you actually angle it towards your face, it's a lot less reflective than it is with the other panel. And so it's just a lot more pleasant to use. And because it's backlit, you really don't need to worry about angling it perfectly like you have to with this other one. It's also going to be quite a bit brighter. This is the maximum brightness here, which is still honestly a pretty dim display by today's standards, but it is a lot better than the original one. And so you'll be able to play this in a lot more gaming environments compared to the original. However, one thing that's really interesting about using this original one is just how muted the colors are. And, there are color correction options within the emulators and stuff, but I didn't realize how accurate that color correction is compared to the original model. If we look at them side by side, you can see that yes, the 34XX has a lot more prominent colors between the two. And there are shaders you can use that will actually allow you to adjust the color. So this is the GBA color shader, and you can see that it makes the colors more muted. I think it is pretty close to the original at this point. Admittedly, it is hard to compare the two because one is backlit and the other is not.
Now, while we're still talking about screens, one really interesting thing about the Anbernic is that it's tuned to a higher frame rate. And this is something that I didn't notice in my review. In fact, a developer named Gamma Squeeze is the one who figured it out. And essentially, this is running at 110 frames per second. And running at a frame rate outside of 60 frames per second can cause some frame pacing issues with certain side-scrolling games. Again, not something that I personally noticed, but other people did. But the nice benefit here is that the Gamma Squeeze also figured out that you can clock it up to 120 Hz, which means you can include black frame insertion. This is a tool I've talked about a lot in my other reviews, but not really for a cheap Linux-based handheld like this one. So I want to cover this in more detail later on once we actually have this built into custom firmware, because I think it's really exciting. If you want to read more about it, I'll have an article linked down below, which will actually show you how to do it on this device.
Now, the other thing to keep in mind is that software-wise, the RG34XX can do a bunch of other systems outside of Game Boy Advance. I've just loaded up, some of the classics here, but you could really throw on everything up to basically PS1. You can also play some Nintendo 64 and Dreamcast games, but I wouldn't really recommend them just because, you don't have any analog sticks on this device, and the performance is not quite there either. For me personally, I've just been using this as a Game Boy Advance machine. I did a whole video about the software setup on this, and so this is what I have it set up for. So I will basically turn on the device and it'll go right into my Game Boy Advance menu. And so this is what I've been using to play these games because I think it's a perfect fit between the screen, the aspect ratio, the resolution, and all that. Now, obviously, there is no replacement for the genuine nostalgic feeling of playing an original Game Boy Advance. You can use your old Game Boy Advance cartridges. So if you have some of these from back in the day, and maybe you got a save game on it, you could do this directly onto the device, and it's going to be just like how it was back in the day, for better or for worse when it comes to the screen. There are also tools that you can use, like this one here, which is called the Save the Hero Builders. So this thing actually has a Game Boy Advance cartridge slot here in the bottom. And so what you do is you plug this in, and then you got to, plug this in and everything else. You put an SD card in here, and it'll actually take your ROM and put it on the SD card as well as your save game. And this works for a number of different systems, including Game Boy Color, Game Boy, as well as Nintendo 64, Sega Genesis, Super Nintendo. There's an attachment for NES as well. So if you are looking to replicate your games, specifically like the actual ROMs that you used back in the day, as well as your save games, you can still play that on the Anbernic. You'll just need a second tool like this to dump everything. But there's something to be said about just playing on original hardware. You've got the D-pad and face buttons and whatnot, but then also there's the accuracy of playing on a system like this, where the input delay and everything else is going to be exactly like how it was because it is the same machine. I think that these emulation devices do a really good job in getting you most of the way there, but they're not going to be a perfect replica. But it really is going to come down to how choosy you are about the overall experience. Do you want to have something that's pitch perfect, or do you think that this is going to be just a little bit more convenient? And so there are a bunch of advantages of using something like an emulation machine. Besides, the display and the ability to play all of your games, it also has the ability to do things like fast forwarding and save states, all those things which are not really present on a Game Boy Advance. So I think in terms of just overall value, I would say that the Anbernic is probably better, but if you are really a stickler for having an original experience, then getting an old Game Boy Advance, maybe updating the screen, doing a mod on it, might just be better suited for you. But for me personally, there's no surprise here that I prefer the emulation device. After all, I've got a YouTube channel that's dedicated to emulation. But, I just think that all of these conveniences that are more modern, like, HDMI out and having custom software options, this is just something that's a little bit more attractive to me. So in wrapping up here, I think there's a lot of advantages between the two, and it really comes down to what you're expecting with these handhelds. I think that the Anbernic RG34XX is probably just better all around in 2025, just because of all the modern conveniences for for it. But in terms of controls, I actually prefer the original Game Boy Advance. I think this D-pad is better, and I do like the lighter touch of these face buttons between the two. So if anything, this makes me want to play the Anbernic more. Essentially, I want to break in these buttons and D-pad a little bit more to see if they get lighter to the touch like the Game Boy Advance, because if we can have the best of both worlds, where we have these lighter touches and better pivot point of the Game Boy Advance, but on the Anbernic, I think that's going to be a win-win.
Now, another thing that came out right before I started finishing up this video is that Anbernic has now released a new color option for the RG34XX. They're calling this one Glacier, and it looks a lot like the Glacier Blue from back in the day. Not quite as blue, but still got a little bit of a tinge to it. And they also told me that they sent one out for me to check out, and so I'll make a video about that one once it arrives.
So I think my big takeaway here is that yes, the Anbernic has a lot more modern conveniences, and this is probably the one that I will play a lot more than original hardware, but this is probably the first time I've seen with a retro emulation device in particular where they've gotten it so close to the original. There have been a couple where they've really tried, but this really is the closest I've ever seen. And so kudos to Anbernic for that, just in really amping up that nostalgia factor. And to be perfectly clear, this is a very niche device. I think it really only excels in playing Game Boy Advance games. And, it isn't the same as the original hardware, but reminds you a lot of that. So this isn't a device that I can recommend for everybody, but if you have one of these old ones, or maybe you got rid of it and you're wanting to replace it, I think that if you want something a little bit more modern, the Anbernic RG34XX is close enough. So let me know what you think in the comments down below. This device has been out for a while now, so I know it's been arriving in people's homes, so have you tried one out? And what do you think of it compared to the original Game Boy Advance? I'm really interested to hear that perspective because, like I mentioned, I never had this original Game Boy Advance back in the day, and so this has been a learning experience for me between these two, just to kind of get a feel for what it was like back in the day versus what we have today. And I think that, yeah, this Anbernic is a really great device if you're only looking for Game Boy Advance and you want this specific form factor and feel. As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.